The green of death. It began, as all great tragedies do, with beauty. London, 1859. The city wheezed under a fog that never quite lifted. Horse-drawn carriages clattered across cobbled streets, slick with soot and rain. The air carried the scent of coal smoke, damp wool, and ambition. Within this gray gloom, the homes of the wealthy offered sanctuary. They were palaces of taste and refinement. Their interiors, a riot of gilded frames, velvet upholstery and wallpaper. Not just any wallpaper, mind you. The newest, most fashionable designs came in a shade, so rich, so exquisite, it seemed to radiate opulence. Scheele's green. It shimmered with the glow of an emerald forest at dawn, vivid and intoxicating. To possess it was to declare one's arrival in polite society. Aristocrats and social climbers alike lined their parlors and drawing rooms with this magnificent hue, unaware that with every breath, every hour spent basking in its elegance, they were drawing death closer. Among those seduced by the color's allure was Lady Eleanor Barham, a woman of delicate frame but iron resolve. Eleanor had clawed her way from the smog-choked factories of Manchester to the drawing rooms of Belgrade. Her marriage to Lord Julian Barham had been one of necessity, not love, a calculated move to escape poverty. She adorned her home not only with antiques and tapestries, but with the sheen of respectability. And it was in the parlor of 43 Withersley Lane that the green wallpaper first took root, like ivy curling up the walls of a forgotten mausoleum. At first, it was a marvel. Guests would gasp and murmur at its radiance. Eleanor would stand near the hearth, one hand resting on the walnut mantel, and smile as they fawned. She believed, as many did, that beauty was power. But the power of Scheele's green was older and crueler. Eleanor began to change. Her nights became restless, punctuated by strange dreams, forests that bled, whispers in the walls, a voice calling her name in the still hours before dawn. She awoke with blood in her handkerchief, a dull ache behind her eyes, and a bitter, metallic taste that clung to her tongue. The physician diagnosed nerves, prescribed laudanum, and suggested she travel to the sea. Lord Barham, ever distant, took to sleeping in his study, citing her increasingly sullen temperament. She wasn't alone. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair and Kensington, other women, wealthy, idle, beautiful, were falling ill. Their skin grew pale and waxy, their hair thinning, their minds trembling on the edge of something vast and terrible. Children sickened. Infants wailed and wasted away. Servants whispered behind closed doors. Something was wrong. Something unseen. And still, the wallpaper hung, bright and proud and terrible. But when no one knew what, no one wanted to know was this. The green was not merely pigment, it was poison. Scheele's green, named after the Swedish chemist who created it in the late 18th century, contained arsenic, a deadly, insidious compound, bound within the powder that made the green so impossibly vivid. When humidity rose, or sunlight, hit the walls just right, microscopic particles flaked into the air, drifted onto clothing, into tea, into lungs. The richer the household, the more wallpaper, the more doom. In the Barham house, the walls breathed death. Late one night, as Eleanor sat beneath the flickering gas lamp, her hands trembling, as she embroidered a shawl she no longer had the strength to wear, she noticed the green, not as a color, but as a presence. It pulsed, just slightly, in the corner of her vision. A flicker, a shimmer. She stood and touched the wall. It was cold, colder than stone, and she swore, as she drew her hand away, that something beneath the surface stirred, like a breath held too long. She began to tear at it. In the morning, Lord Barham found her collapsed on the floor, nails blackened, fingers bloodied, the wallpaper in tatters around her. She was murmuring, eyes wide, lips cracked, over and over. It watches, it waits. The doctor came. She was sedated. The wallpaper was replaced. But the new paper was green as well. Perhaps a different pattern lily instead of vine's butt. The same deep, intoxicating emerald. Lord Barham said it was the color she liked best. And who could blame him? He had guests to consider. And so the pattern repeated, not just in that house, but in hundreds. In estates and townhouses. In nurseries and salons. The sickness spread without sound, without name. A quiet epidemic, and no one dared speak of it, because beauty was status. And to question it was to court scandal. No one, that is, except a chemist in Oxfordshire. A man of no title, no fortune, but a mind sharp enough to see the connection and brave enough to pull the first thread. His name was Dr. Nathaniel Pritchard, and he had begun to suspect that behind every beautiful death was a wall whispering secrets in green.
The chemist who saw too much. Dr. Nathaniel Pritchard did not believe in ghosts. He believed in compounds, in heat, in pressure, in the elemental truths beneath appearances. He was a thin man with a persistent cough and an unfortunate haircut, whose conversation tended to stray into lectures. And yet, Behind his dull spectacles lived a mind too curious to leave mysteries unexplored. His fascination with arsenic began with insects. In his early work, Pritchard studied how arsenic-based dyes affected the natural world. He'd noticed that moths dropped dead when placed near green-dyed fabrics. It was strange, certainly, but he suspected contamination. Then came a letter from his cousin, recently widowed to's. Wife had wasted away in her parlor, a room freshly decorated in that same fashionable green. Her death, marked by vomiting, tremors, and bleeding gums, had been dismissed as a fever of the blood. But the room ... the room had reeked of rot. Something in Pritchard's mind clicked. He began collecting samples, wallpaper clippings from old estates, bits of drapery, flecks of pigment. He scraped them into tiny glass vials and watched them under the microscope. What he saw horrified him. Crystalline dusts that broke apart in the moist air, releasing arsenic vapors invisible to the eye, but lethal to the lung. In laboratory conditions, when exposed to heat or damp, the pigment fumed. It smoked like something alive. He wrote letters. 2 fellow scientists. 2 wallpaper manufacturers. 2 Parliament. His words were precise. Kalinicland ignored. Arsenic was too common, too profitable. It was in rat poison, yes, but also in beauty products, paints, children's toys. To admit its danger would mean uprooting an entire economy of appearances. The government bought. One MP laughed and said, "Next you'll tell us our carpets wish us dead." Undeterred, Pritchard turned to the press, but newspapers of the time were preoccupied with cholera outbreaks, opium dens, and the usual London miseries. No editor wanted to run a story suggesting that the sitting rooms of the rich were graveyards in disguise. It was a truth too impolite to print. So Pritchard changed his approach. He went door to door. His letters became visits. He appeared at the homes of the wealthy, gaunt and pale, holding his case of instruments like a priest, holding relics. Some listened. Most did not. At the Harrington estate, he was thrown out for frightening the children. At Lady Whitcomb's, he was offered Scheele and politely ignored. But one visit changed everything. He was summoned to a townhouse in Bayswater. A young maid had read one of his discarded pamphlets and begged her mistress to let the arsenic man examine their walls. The mistress, a widow named Clara Morton, had lost 2 children, 2 summer complaints within a year. She was desperate. Pritchard examined the nursery. He lit a candle and held it near a strip of peeling wallpaper. Within seconds, a faint garlicky odor filled the air, the smell of arsenic vaporizing. His hands trembled. He turned to Clara and spoke the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "Madam, your children did not die of fever. They were poisoned by this room." Clara Morton ripped the wallpaper down that same night. The story spread not through newspapers, but in whispers, across dinner tables and garden parties. The idea was unthinkable. Wallpaper, poisonous. And yet, the symptoms matched. The bleeding gums, the pale skin, the slow descent into madness. Doctors, long frustrated by the inability to explain such cases, began to take notice. Not officially, of course. There was no bill passed, no grand inquiry. But in chemists' journals and among quiet scholars, the truth unfurled like mildew beneath a painted surface. Meanwhile, Eleanor Barham was dying. Her hair had turned brittle. Her once rosy cheeks were ghostly, now stretched tight over high bones. She no longer spoke much, except to murmur to the walls. Lord Barham dismissed her illness as hysteria, though he, too, had begun to cough. The wallpaper remained. One day, their servant boy, Thomas, fell ill. Within a week, he was dead. The doctor said, influenza. Pritchard, hearing of the case through a former colleague, decided to pay one last visit to the Barham's home. He stood at the threshold of 43 Withersley Lane, coat slick with rain, and knocked. He was not invited in. Lord Barham refused to see him, but as he turned to leave, a shape appeared in the upstairs window. Gaunt and wide-eyed, fingers pressed to the glass like a prisoner in a dream. Pritchard bowed silently and left. He would never return. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Barham died in her sleep. Her cause of death was listed as melancholia, complicated by consumption. The wallpaper was buried with her. Lord Barham had it burned in the garden, though he swore he heard it crackle and scream. It was never spoken of again. But in that moment, behind the polite silence of London society, something had begun to shift. The color green, once a symbol of wealth, now carried a shadow. Murmurs turned to doubts. Chemists began offering arsenic-free pigments. Manufacturers quietly removed the deadliest compounds. No apologies were made, no guilt was admitted, but the green began to vanish. And the death count slowed, but not before one final victim. Not a woman, not a child, but the man who knew too much and dared to speak the truth. Dr. Nathaniel Pritchard, and his death would be the most mysterious of all. The silence that follows truth. There are few things more dangerous in Victorian England than being correct too early. After the death of Eleanor Barham, a curious sort of silence wrapped itself around Dr. Nathaniel Pritchard. Invitations to speak at the Royal Society ceased. Colleagues avoided his gaze. Grants evaporated. He became, in every sense, untouchable not through scandal, but something far worse. Social unease. He had named the unnameable. He had accused wealth and fashion and refinement itself of murder. And those things, in England, were sacred. His lectures grew more urgent. His tone, once measured, began to fray. He spoke of rooms with lungs, of ornament as execution, of children made pallbearers in their own nurseries. His papers were refused publication. He was labeled eccentric, overwrought, a man too clever by half. Still, he worked, alone, increasingly poor. He turned his modest cottage into a laboratory of illness. His walls were hung with samples, faded strips of rose-patterned wallpaper, carefully catalogued by date and death toll. He slept in a corner, surrounded by the ghosts of colors that should never have existed. And somewhere within him, something broke. One morning in April, 1862, a passing constable noticed that the curtains of Pritchard's cottage had not moved for days. The chimney was cold. The door, unlocked. Inside, the air was heavy with an acrid sweetness. He found the chemist seated at his desk, head bowed over a manuscript. A candle had burned to the nub. His eyes were open, glassy. He was dead. At first, it was assumed he'd succumbed to his own experiments poisoned by the very arsenic he had so long fought to expose. But when the coroner arrived, he found no burns in the lungs, no signs of arsenic dust. Pritchard had died, apparently, of cardiac arrest. But there were peculiar details. The manuscript he'd been writing his final treatise on the psychological effects of pigment-induced delirium was missing. In its place sat only a single sentence, scribbled hastily in his hand. They are not blind, they simply prefer the dark. The cottage was emptied. His samples discarded. His name faded from medical journals. But among a small, silent circle of chemists, his memory endured like a bruise. And more curiously still, months after his death, factories across England quietly altered their formulas. Wallpaper companies began using new dyes, less vibrant, more dull, but demonstrably safer. No fanfare, no admission of guilt, but the arsenic green was gone, not because the world had believed Pritchard, but because, perhaps, it feared him. In the years that followed, the deaths slowed, slowly, imperceptibly. The wealthy congratulated themselves on the progress of science. New illnesses were given names that obscured their cause. Neurasthenia, hysteria, parlor rot. And if an old widow in Chelsea still muttered about voices in the walls, or if a housemaid swore the wallpaper was breathing, they were dismissed as relics of a superstitious age. But not everyone forgot. Claire of Morton, the widow whose children had died beneath emerald vines, She spent her days visiting convalescent homes, bringing food to girls made frail by something no physician could name. She carried with her always a clipping of wallpaper in a sealed glass frame, a souvenir of her own private war. When she died in 1901, it was buried with her, per her request. A priest asked why she would want such an ugly thing in her coffin. She replied, "Sofford, to remind the worms." By then, the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. There were new poisons to fear. Electricity, radium, industrial smoke. The green was just another forgotten shade in a palette of horrors. But even today, buried in antique shops and curling behind crumbling plaster, the remnants remain. Wallpaper from the era, if scraped and tested, still reveals its venomous truth. Tourists in old Victorian homes may marvel at the rich hues of parlors long sealed. Some even run their fingers along the patterns, admiring the craftsmanship. They don't know. They don't feel the pulse. They don't hear what lingers beneath the paper, the breath of something patient, something that once killed with beauty and now only waits. And so the question is not why rich Victorians died from their wallpaper. The question is, what else have we wrapped our lives in? Mistaking poison for elegance. And what price will we pay to keep the illusion?
The Victorians were masters of illusion. They built beauty like barricade stick velvet curtains, lacquered elaborate manazole to conceal what festered underneath. Death was everywhere in that century. In the gutters, in the factories, in the birthing beds. And so the upper classes made their homes into sanctuaries, temples of order and taste. But the truth, cruel and inescapable, was this. They brought the rot inside with them. In Scheele's green, they found not only a pigment, but a promise that ugliness and suffering and the indignities of the poor could be sealed out with a few layers of paper. What they didn't understand, what they refused to understand, was that nature does not obey class. Arsenic doesn't care about silver spoons. The poison was democratic. And yet, it lingered in secret. Because the tragedy of the wallpaper was never just the deaths it caused. But how was Allie? Those deaths were buried beneath silence and wealth. Even today, some argue the danger was exaggerated, that Pritchard and others like him were alarmists, that not enough people died to warrant the panic. But how many are enough when death slips in without a name? When a mother buries a child without ever knowing why his lips turn blue? When a housemaid coughs herself into the grave before 20 and no one even records her name? You see, arsenic didn't only kill the rich. It killed the poor who scrubbed the walls, the children who worked in the dye factories, their skin blistering from the dust, the seamstresses who handled curtains laced with it, the workers who swept the floors of paper mills, coughing blood by candlelight. They were the ones whose names we do not remember, whose deaths were not tragic, but convenient. There is one final story. In 1865, 3 years after Pritchard's death, a house in Devonshire burned to the ground. It was a modest estate belonging to a retired textile merchant. The fire began in the drawing room, where a new wallpaper had just been installed. Firemen reported strain, fumes, thick, yellowish smoke with a sweet, sickening edge. Everyone inside perished. The cause was declared electrical, but in the ruins, a single scrap of green wallpaper was found, preserved between charred beams. It tested positive for arsenic. Some say the merchant had ignored warnings. Others whisper it was the paper itself that the green burned hotter, faster, as if it were eager to finish what it had begun. A folk tale, perhaps, but such tales carry the weight of truth, not measured in data, but in dread. And so, the legend of the green wallpaper lingers not as a ghost story, but as a warning that death does not always wear the face of malice. Sometimes, it wears the face of fashion. Sometimes, it is stitched into the very fabric of what we covet. And sometimes, we are the ones who choose it, invite it, pay extra for it, and hang it lovingly on our walls. Even now, the story repeats in new forms. In toxic cosmetics, in microplastics laced through oceans, in chemicals hidden inside food labels we can't pronounce. Still, we chase beauty, convenience, perfection. Still, we believe that if something is expensive enough, elegant enough, it must be safe. But what if the price of elegance is always blood, hidden well behind polished wood and scented air? And what if the ghosts of the Victorian dead are not resting peacefully, but watching quietly amused as we make the same bargain they once did, to die beautifully, to die without knowing why, to die in rooms we built with our own hands. So, next time you walk through an antique home and feel a sudden chill, next time you pass a wall drenched in forgotten color and swear you heard it breathe, ask yourself, what's buried behind the wallpaper, and who paid the price for you not to know?